Is a Muslim brain drain underway in France? With Islamophobia on the rise, a new book says young, educated French Muslims are leaving the country. Does France's upcoming snap election risk further alienating the EU's biggest Muslim population? And could their flight benefit France's allies? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. For years, immigration has been high on the political agenda in France, but little, if nothing, has been said about emigration. In a climate of increasing Islamophobia in the country, some researchers have been looking into specifically how many French Muslims are leaving, taking their education and skills abroad to escape increasingly anti-Muslim measures being enshrined into law. The country's century-old constitutional principle of laïcité ensures the separation of church and state and guarantees religious freedom. But in the past 2 decades, the government has placed greater restrictions on predominantly Muslim symbols. In 2004, headscarves were banned in schools. In 2011, face coverings were banned in public places. 5 years later, in 2016, Islamic swimwear, known as burkinis, were banned from public pools and beaches. Last year, the government banned abayas in state schools. And now, as of July 26, 2024, French athletes are prohibited from wearing Islamic coverings at the Paris Olympics. Now, all this while under the leadership of more centrist French governments. And now that President Emmanuel Macron has called a snap election, many French Muslims fear that leadership will take a hard turn to the right.
I'm of Lebanese origin. I was born in Lebanon. People like me, on top of which I'm a Muslim, will be the first victims of Emmanuel Macron's risky bet if we find ourselves with a far-right prime minister in our country. Minorities, women, immigrants are going to suffer from this risky bet by Emmanuel Macron. I think it's a very dangerous game. He's adding fuel to the fire.
Well, their fear of the far right taking power is justified. The National Rally Party currently enjoys a comfortable lead in the polls ahead of the first round of voting this Sunday. Its former president, Marine Le Pen, openly views Islam as a threat to French identity, advocating for a national headscarf ban in all public areas and stopping construction of all new mosques.
Our idea of cooperation in Europe, our shared desire to protect our citizens, our common refusal to see our country submerged under the flow of migrants. Fundamentally, the fight we're waging is a commitment against two totalitarianism, globalization and Islamism, to which the European Union is responding respectively through adherence and complacency.
Well, the National Rally's current president, 28-year-old Jordan Bardella, says his party will also scrap nationality rights for children born and raised in France by foreign parents. But his main priority appears to be keeping foreigners out in the first place.
If I become prime minister of the country at the beginning of July, I will make the issue of immigration and border control one of my priorities.
So where could these far-right policies leave 6 million French Muslims? The head of the French Institute of Muslim Civilization says the consequences would be no less than catastrophic. And the increasingly hostile environment is already having an impact. France, Loving It But Leaving It is a controversial new book that claims the Islamophobic atmosphere is causing a brain drain, with educated French Muslims leaving France for countries like the UK and Canada. Co-author Olivier Esteves fears this trend will only worsen. More and more French Muslims feel they are no longer at home in France, and of those who have left the country, over 70% report departing at least in part because of racism and discrimination. And Professor Olivier Esteves joins me now to talk further about his book, France, Loving It But Leaving It. Olivier, thanks so much for being with me on The Newsmakers. First, tell us why you carried out the research into French Muslims actually emigrating and why you thought it was worthy of a book. What concerned you about what's happening to the Muslim community in France?
Well, it's pretty anecdotal, but what happened was that I remember I was teaching at the University of Lille a couple of years ago, and I realized that a few students young hijabi young women who were actually living in Lille, and some of them actually took the Eurostar into London, which is quite convenient when you live in the downtown of Lille. So it dawned on me that there was probably material to actually do a research project on this, and then what happened thereafter actually proved us wrong. Proved us right. Sorry, proved us right.
Proved us right. And I mean, talk about what happened thereafter, because it has been noted that the research cited in this book is mostly conducted by your own team at the University of Lille. So tell us why readers should trust its veracity.
Well, everything in the book is just purely empirical research. At every single page, what we do together is that we weave a sort of collective narrative of all these French Muslim people who have left the country for 2, 3, 10, 20, 22 years, and who live, as you said yourself, in Canada, the UK, Dubai. And what we provide is just massive, empirical evidence of what we call, or what many of our interviewees call, an actual brain drain that indeed affects the French economy.
I want to talk more about how it affects the French economy, but first tell us more about that anecdotal evidence you were referring to and what they specifically told you about why they were leaving. France is their home.
Okay.
They were born and raised there, so why do they want out?
Yeah, this is fundamental when you refer to the fact that they are French, right? These people self-identify as French, the vast majority of them, and also they self-identify as Muslim. But in France, it's been growingly difficult to self-identify as Muslim and to practice Islam as a religion, and at the same time self-identify as French. And so a lot of the interviewees that we talk to, they will say things like, in France, I couldn't breathe anymore because of the constant harassment by be it politicians or the media, or even the sense that it's seen as barely acceptable to be a Muslim. But if you are a practicing Muslim, whose Muslim identity is visible in the public sphere, in public space, this is seen as unacceptable. And that, of course, led these people, many of whom have degrees, in economics, in various kinds of disciplines, to actually leave the country. And they realize when they go to Canada or the United States or the UK that to be a Muslim out there is something pretty ordinary, pretty banal.
Yeah. And you know what, Olivier, I have to say, it's kind of ironic that France has always been so determined, really, to maintain its presence and its so-called sphere of influence in its former colonies, but then at the same time railing against immigration for those, from those same countries. Why is that the policy? Why does France want so much of involvement in its former colonies, but don't want the culture and the people to come from there?
Yeah, I think France has been kind of trapping itself through a collective narrative of secularism, which laïcité, so in the French language, which by and large is dog whistle politics for referring to Islam and referring to sort of stigmatizing Islam as a problem. And so more and more people, millions of French people are led to believe, because this is what they've been told for so many years, since 1989, really, the first headscarf affair, that to show religion in public space is a real problem. It means that you don't belong. But of course, France has a strongly Catholic tradition. There are churches everywhere. There are many bank holidays. There are strictly Christian holidays. There are, Catholic processions in different parts of the country, and it doesn't seem to bother anyone. It doesn't bother me as such. And so I'm answering the question. I'm answering your question because by saying that, the country to a large extent has sort of trapped itself in a collective narrative that indeed would seem to exclude many of the people whose origins are to be found indeed in countries of North Africa, for instance. Right.
So tell us then, does this upcoming snap election, risk further alienating, this is the EU's biggest Muslim population, further alienating them, and then in turn, could this flight that you've referred to just benefit France's allies and neighbors instead?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very bad at forecasting electoral outcomes. But what seems clear is that to be anti-Muslim and to say it openly has become almost part of the mainstream in France. And I think Emmanuel Macron's responsibility in this is huge. I mean, he's not the only one, of course. All the presidents before him, including Hollande, and then, of course, Sarkozy, are largely to blame too. But the point I'm trying to make is that this sort of anti-immigration narrative and anti-Muslim narrative that clearly, stigmatizes a part of the population in France that is French. I mean, it's fundamental to keep in mind that these people were born and bred in France for the vast majority of them. And you can see this by looking at the way, for instance, the environment is almost never talked about in the elections. Now, when the environment is not talked about, I know it sounds pretty counterintuitive to say this, but when the environment is barely talked about, it means that other issues are being raised as very important issues. And indeed, immigration is one of them. The political tone clearly of the election is set by the far right party.
Yeah. Olivier, stay with us now, because I would like to discuss all of this further with two more panelists that are joining us. And let me introduce from Saint-Louis, France, President of the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations, Hania Chalal. And from Paris, political sociologist and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, Amel Boubekeur. Now, we did reach out to representatives of the National Rally for participation in this program. Unfortunately, no one was available to join us today. But let me ask Hania first a question. Hania, you have just heard the arguments that Olivier put forward in this book. First of all, do you believe it's true that young Muslims are fleeing France because of increasing Islamophobia?
First, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. To answer very quickly your question, yes, absolutely. I think that young Muslims are fleeing France not by choice, but out of necessity, because as it stands with this current approach toward Muslims, it's not a safe place for Muslims and Muslim youth. So this book and other research have shown that young Muslims are increasingly leaving France because they no longer feel safe. And it is the consequence of more than 15 years of national politics centered around the question of identity and what it means to be French. And there is this forced duality between being French and being Muslims, as if the two are not possible. And
then why do you stay?
Why do I stay, and why the wider Muslim youth is staying? I think that out of love of this country, but I think that being summoned to answer the question, are you French or are you Muslim, is fueling the hostile environment, and neutrality cloaked Islamophobic policies and social exclusion are what's driving Muslim youth away, talented individuals to seek opportunities elsewhere.
Yeah. Amel, let me ask you, how detrimental is it to France that young, educated people are leaving?
It is very much detrimental, but as a sociologist, I also have to unpack a bit this idea of an Islamic exodus, not canceling the fact that there's a lot of Muslims who are quitting France because of the discrimination they are experiencing. But this Islamic exodus is also part of a broader French brain drain among French youth. French Muslims that I have interviewed, for example, they also quote high taxes, bureaucratic hurdles for entrepreneurs, etc., has a reason for leaving. Of course, discrimination adds another layer of motivation for young Muslims to seek opportunities elsewhere. But it depends also highly about their political background, their economic background, and the kind of opportunities they may find elsewhere. For example, you may have young Muslims who, for religious reasons, have decided to quit France and to seek refuge in an Islamic country. This is commonly known as hijrah. And those young Muslims may not not choose Canada or UK or whatever as people who may have more important professional opportunities, but use this exit from France as a way to find peace and not be involved in political debates anymore. You also have, please go ahead.
Let me ask you quickly, Amel, though. I mean, is it fair, because the term that's being used is this institutional Islamophobia that is in large part driving people away. And I do agree with what you're saying. I know a lot of French youth have left the country because they find it difficult to get job opportunities. And these are, the ideal people for the National Rally Party that are also leaving because of economic conditions and sometimes class discrimination that it can exist, they say, in France. But is this institutionalized Islamophobia really there? And is it potentially going to get worse should more right-wing politicians take power in this election?
Well, again, the fact that a lot of leaving is also justified by the lack of institutional justice that they can seek for their own cases if they are discriminated. So that's part, of course, of the lack of institutional responses. But you also have a whole cultural aspect where you have a lot of success stories that are actually counter-narratives to the media narratives around Muslims that are honest full citizens, of French Muslims thriving abroad that are widely shared actually within communities. And there's also this kind of rag to riches stories that contrast sharply with experience of discrimination and limited advancement in France indeed. But I would say that what I'm trying to expose more interesting reasons for them to quit France is that Muslims do not react only as Muslims. It's true that institutional Islamophobia has a huge impact on them, but they also have broad dreams and wishes of seeing what is going on elsewhere as the other people. When it comes to the votes,
let me just, I want to come back to Olivier quickly, because this might sound like a simplistic question, but I mean, is there an easy fix here? Or is the Islamophobia and xenophobia that is there, is it too ingrained now at this point?
It's a very tough question to answer in just a few seconds. I think that one of the issues that I think we try to explore, especially in the conclusion to the book, and it's quite an original, but we need to hammer this point, is that the French state needs to recognize and use the concept of Islamophobia, which literally they never do. Now, when you ask the question about state Islamophobia or institutional Islamophobia, you can see it through things that are done, declarations that are made, and also things that are not done. Now, for instance, when 5 years ago there was a terrorist attack against the Bayonne mosque in the southwest of France, no minister actually visited the place. Whenever a synagogue, on the contrary, is attacked, you get ministers that go there straight away on the spot, and they make declarations. The French state has not recognized to this day that there was a terrorist attack that was carried out against the Bayonne mosque, because it is a mosque. These are signs that if you are a Muslim, and I'm not a Muslim, if you are a Muslim, you feel that the state is not there to protect you. And this is something that a certain number of quite politicized French people that now live abroad have told us. They have told us things like, individual racism, we can deal with. But when the state does pretty much the same, we don't feel protected anymore. Therefore, we have to leave.
Yeah. Hania, that plays into what you were saying earlier. But let me ask you this, because there's another question here, and that the same kind of criticism, I guess, has been made of, of neighboring Germany, that somehow either the Muslim population in the country has itself failed to integrate with the wider country's culture, or that the government has failed to integrate its immigrant and Muslim populations. Do you think there's a role there, or are these societies in themselves just too individualistic anyway to really talk well about integration, and that people will have their own individual cultures that they should be able to preserve in the context of a democracy?
Yeah, I see your question. I recognize it. It is an interesting question to answer. But I think that here the core and primary issue is that the political climate in France has contributed to driving away young Muslims, and I think that again it's a result of decades of policies and narratives portraying young Muslims and Muslims. At the wider level in the French society as problematic, and I think that the result of it is an anti-Muslim sentiment that is not just accepted but also widespread. I mean, minorities have always been the sensor to measure the shrinking of the civic space in a democratic country, and the consequence of the reduction of the civic space in France is the institutional and structural Islamophobia engineered by the French government throughout the past years, and this should alarm anyone who believes in democracy, I believe, and anyone who believes as well in individual and collective freedoms. So again, your question might seem interesting, but I feel like the issue here is how can we protect minorities in different countries, in this case specifically a Muslim minority in France, because institutional and structural Islamophobia severely limits the ability of the Muslim community to engage and contribute in public life. I mean, we're talking about mosques, Islamic centers, Muslim-led organizations who are facing an increased scrutiny and pressure from the government. I would like as well to remind everyone here that in 2022, the Minister of Interior have claimed to have closed more than 700 Muslim organizations, establishments, mosques, and so on, and seized up to 46 million of euros in assets from the Muslim community. And this is a case of outright theft, and the crackdown on the Muslim community is the primary factor in French Muslim sentiment of insecurity.
So, Hania, quickly, do you have any hope that things could possibly improve with the result of this upcoming election?
With the result of this upcoming election, I feel like, I mean, all eyes are on France at the moment. We're only 4 days away from the first round of the most crucial elections in millions of lives of French, of Muslim faith, but also of minority backgrounds of any kind. And the far right has never been this close to govern, and we have to blame the liberals for that. And I feel like the hope is something that we can keep as young people as high as possible. But at the same time, it feels like the Paris 2024 Olympics of hate and Islamophobia has opened a bit earlier with the recent European elections and the snap parliamentary election campaign that have demonstrated that for the sake of a few votes, politicians are excellent runners to the far right and willing to gamble with the lives of millions of their citizens. So yes, there is hope. But at the same time, I would like to hold accountable our politicians who are easy to delve into Islamophobic rhetoric and narratives.
Yeah, Amel, do you share that hope, I guess? And would you also like to see politicians held more accountable?
Happily. Well, actually, again, there's multiple positioning. When you see French Muslims abroad, it's important to understand that they have not a problem with Frenchness. They're very proud to be labeled as French, but with the France's political offer. And France's political offer actually is not, in my opinion, going to offer more solutions, even if with the left-wing parties, offer more solutions to target discrimination effectively. It is so entrenched in France that it needs to be a collective effort. But at the same time, you also have French Muslims who are staying in France because not all of them have the opportunity to leave the country and face national opportunity to do so. You also have French Muslims that are somehow who withdrew from the political scene and are just not concerned anymore with the fact that the Rassemblement National, the extreme right party, may win in France, and they are just waiting for better days, but without being willing to be once again the ones who are going to be shown as either France's traps or France's solutions for better days.
Fair enough. Olivier, I'll tell you what, we're down to our last couple minutes. So having heard this exchange, what are your final thoughts here going into this election and its risks of potentially further alienating France's Muslim population?
Well, it's very much, there's something like a sort of implacable slippery slope there, and it seems that there is no end of, stigmatizing a community, many of whose members is actually French. So the prospects are pretty grim. But just to add one or two footnotes very quickly to this debate we've been having, in the book, I think it's fundamental to remember that we have talked to a substantial minority of people who don't self-identify as Muslim, but they have names like Muhammad, or they look Arab, so to speak. And they are stigmatized in just the same way, because they are discriminated against on the job market. That's one point. The last point I wanted to make is the comparison that you started to draw between Germany on the one hand and France on the other hand. What we have realized through our study is that a large number of the French people that we talk to, by the time that they actually leave France, they are not seen as Muslims or as Arabs anymore. They are seen as French. If you speak English like this, if your name is Mohamed, people will believe that you are French, not that you are Muslim. It's as easy as that. So it makes the comparison quite difficult in a way.
It's quite interesting. Olivier, unfortunately, that will actually have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers, because we are now completely out of time. But I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with us on this edition. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.